IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy. Today, I have with me my colleagues from the Takshashila Institution, Saurabh, Todi, and Amit Kumar, to discuss some of the recent developments in India-China relations. Now, just a few days ago, we've seen a report in the Wall Street Journal which talks about the expulsion of journalists from both India and China in a very dramatic light by arguing that this is the worst that can happen to bilateral relations, and it indicates that there is no sign of thawing in the relations. Then we see that there is a report that the 27th meeting of the working mechanism for consultation and coordination on India-China border affairs was held in person in New Delhi. And the External Affairs Ministry statement from India's side came out on the 31st of May. And that meeting in particular focused again on achieving the objective of peace and tranquility in the relations, and there was an agreement to also hold the next, which is the 19th round of core commander level meeting as soon as possible. And when we look at these developments, some obvious questions come to our mind, which is, on the one hand, government to government relations are both focused towards what they call the goal of peace and tranquility, not only on the border, but also in the overall relationship. And I am convinced that there is some actual sentiment, there is some real sentiment on both sides to have this happen, to actualize it. But on the other hand, the reality isn't matching the rhetoric, because on ground, we are indeed seeing situations like the expulsion of journalists from each other's countries and the failure of the previous core commander level talks in addressing some issues India refers to as legacy, which is the issue of Dipsang and Demchok. So, in light of this disbalance between rhetoric and reality, in light of the fact that despite China's foreign policy approach to all other regions in the world, except for the US, of course, becoming much more moderate, but not towards India, how do we see, what light do we see the recent developments in, and what should our key takeaways be for the near future of relations without being too optimistic? For that very reason, I have my colleagues with me, and we'll be touching upon some of these recent developments in brief before coming to some sort of a conclusion about what we can learn about the relations in the contemporary times from that. Welcome, Saurabh. Welcome, Amit. Happy to have you here.
Thank you, Anushka.
Thank you, Anushka.
So, Saurabh, let me come to you first. What do you think this reportage and, of course, the actual events surrounding the expulsion of journalists from each other's country mean? I mean, there's some brief history to it going back to the past 4 or 5 years. And I don't know if there's a debate about who started this first, or, who should have done it and who shouldn't have, whose response was more accurate according to whatever they felt was a provocation. So I'm not going to indulge in that, but I'm going to leave to you to present our listeners with some of the facts of the case, and what does this kind of say about the tensions between...
Yeah. So, I would say, Anushka, see, I think one can keep debating, right, whether it was India who first expelled Chinese journalists, or, it was right because it was like during the, or in the aftermath of Galwan crisis. And then, now China is only retaliating, or vice versa, right? So I think that by itself, I think is not as important as the fact that, again, the people-to-people contact between India and China is already very low. I mean, it has not been as good as, obviously, as it has the potential. At the same time, after COVID and obviously after Galwan, the relationship is frozen in that aspect. Then even I think the representation of journalists and media, both in India and China, of each other countries, has been limited and has been declining over the years. So now to be in a situation where there is no Indian or Chinese journalists in each other's countries is actually very worrying, right? Because if you see that, I mean, despite the restrictions, I would say in China, but I think having a like your correspondent in a foreign country who is your, a regional challenger and an adversary is very important. And if you see the recent, I think there was one survey released by Tsinghua University saying that I think only about 8% of Chinese have a positive view of India, right? So lack of any representative, let's say, of Chinese media in India shows that it further reduces avenues for understanding of each other. And now I think both countries and their people have to depend just on official sources, or if need be, maybe official delegations of journalists who will be invited by each other country. I mean, we see, I think, the head of a leading media news channel, I think, was in China, I think, at the invitation of the government, I think, a few days ago. But so I think in that way, it's sad and worrying, and I think it does not bode well for the relationship, because there was some kind of hope that given that both Qin Gang, the Chinese foreign minister, and then the Chinese defense minister, they came to India for in-person meetings for SCO. So there may be some movement towards at least having a workable relationship, but that seems to not be happening. So this is very concerning, and I don't think there's any way out of it for now.
Right, and I think on broader people to people ties, I did see a tweet from the Chinese spokesperson in India, which said something like, in the first 5 months of 2023, they've issued visas to over 60,000 Indians for the purposes of business, study, tourism, family reunion, so on and so forth. But there is no mention of permanence in there, because apart from students, the only other person with active insights on the ground would of course be journalists, and there is no reference to journalists, which seems as if they're, even though they're arguing that Indians are welcome to China, and the Chinese side is also saying something like, we need journalists to maintain peace and tranquility. Like you said, that workable relationship isn't really being seen as translated into action. So just out of curiosity, in your opinion, do you think India should go back on some of its decisions to displace Chinese journalists from the country? Do you think that can encourage China to also roll back on its decision, considering, like you said, that sentiment seems to be there?
I mean, it depends, right? I mean, I think also I think there is not enough public knowledge, but like, why was it that the Chinese journalists were expelled? So if there were some security concerns, or if there were some concerns regarding, their activities, then that's understandable. But still, I think having, presence of journalists, I think is important. So I think both countries, I don't think it could be, one country is more magnanimous and does change their policy on its own. But I think this could be one of the confidence building measures where both countries at least allow like some representation from their media houses, both print and I would say video, to be in each other's country. So
Right.
I think this could be a good, I think, step forward, but I am not hopeful. I think because the situation does not seem very conducive for that.
Right. Amit, your thoughts on this, if any?
So, so if going back on this decision, if India going back on this decision allows Indian journalists to have their presence in China, of course, I think it would be a good start, because journalists, indeed, they are eyes and ears of Indian public in China, and China being our most the greatest adversary that we continue to face in the recent times. I think presence of Indian correspondents is necessary to have insight into the domestic policy, the economic policies, and the foreign policy of China. So if there could be a trade-off wherein Indian journalists could be allowed in China, and Chinese, and in return Chinese journalists could be allowed in India, I think it should be a go-to thing for both the countries.
Right. And I think the point you mentioned about Indian journalists being the eyes and ears of the Indian public is also true in the sense that I think Anant Krishnan and the others, in fact, were doing a lot of good work on understanding how top Chinese political processes work. They did some excellent journalism on the 20th Party Congress. And especially for me, I think I speak for myself, but also all the others in this virtual room, that we all got to learn a lot from what they had to say about the Congress. So this also brings me to the elephant in the room, which is indeed the fundamental cause of tensions between the two countries, which is again the border issue. Like I said at the start of this podcast, the 19th round of core commander level talks is expected to be held sometime very soon, according to the 27th working mechanism meeting today. And at the same time, the 18th round of talks didn't yield a lot of results when it comes to some basic points of contention between the two countries. And of course, Amit, you have done some work on understanding perspectives on border tensions. So what do you think we're seeing here? We of course, there's also a lot of recent reportage about, and I think this was a report in the Telegraph that said that Chinese officials have demanded from the Indo-Tibetan border police that they be allowed to create a 15-kilometer buffer zone in the very strategically vital area of Depsang Plains, even though they're already around 18 kilometers entrenched in that region. So how do you think I don't think we have any public knowledge on this, but how do you think the Indian side has responded to this? And what does the overall border scenario look like?
So for me, a few key highlights on India-China LAC situation that we need to remember before we delve into this topic further is, one, that this confrontation between India and Indian troops and the PLA have dragged on for more than 3 years now, and is it into its fourth year. And the only time the situation on the border prolonged for more than 3 years was in 1987, 88, when a resolution took almost 9 years. Second, although through these over the course of 18 core commander level talks, we have managed to achieve disengagement on 5 friction points, starting from Galwan, southern Pangong Tso Lake, northern Pangong Tso Lake, then Gogra and Hot Spring. The third highlight would be that all these places where disengagement has been achieved, they have been compounded with or complemented with a creation of a buffer zone that has become an issue of politicization domestically in India, and the opposition has attacked the government of being ceding territory to China. Third, there hasn't been, and an added factor to this is that while we have seen disengagement, there has been no de-escalation so far, and more than 60,000 troops continue to face from each side along the LAC. Fourth is that even though we have achieved some sort of progress, or if you want to call it, on these 4 friction points, we haven't seen a resolution on Depsang Plains and the Demcho. Both these friction points, previously Chinese were not very keen on discussing these, as they termed both these friction points as legacy issues that were prevalent before the 2020 Kalwan crisis happened, and therefore they were not very keen on discussing this. So, we could actually give it to the Indian diplomats and the army personnel that they have managed to bring these 2 issues back on negotiating table, and now that these 2 friction points are being discussed. And as you said, the PLA have already demanded 1920 kilometers of buffer in Depsang Plains, which is very interesting given this is the exact number of kilometers that the Chinese have intruded into Indian territory. So, there's not much promise. The defense ministers of the 2 countries met during the SCO summit, and it was followed by the meeting of S. Jaishankar and Chengang. And not much progress was seen on these issues. And I continue to think, I don't think India is going to accept the proposal that the Chinese have proposed. And we'll have to wait and see. And I think this is going to be a long, protracted confrontation between both the sides.
Right. And I think once again, we'll see at the 19th core commander level talks that these 2 issues will be reiterated by the Indian side. And I think it's safe to say that given that the Chinese are now demanding a buffer zone in the area that they've already entrenched beyond the Indian claim lines, I don't think they're going to take these issues, the resolution of these 2 issues seriously until and unless, they're going to put this as a demand force that until and unless they're granted this kind of buffer zone, they're not going to negotiate any further. I mean, this is very much a possibility. And now, of course, the tensions between the two countries are intruding on how India and China interact at the global stage. For example, recently we saw at the Forum for India Pacific Islands Cooperation on 22nd May, I think, that Indian Prime Minister Modi made a speech where he took an apparent dig at China. Now I don't know if that's what was going on in Modi's mind, but this seems to be some sort of a consensus between analysts and journalists that Modi said that there were friends who he considered trustworthy, but they turned out to be otherwise, and thank God that India was the friend to Pacific Island countries that perhaps China or whoever Modi is talking about wasn't. And then, in response to what Modi said, the Papua New Guinea Prime Minister, Papua New Guinea, by the way, was hosting FIPIC, and the Prime Minister of PNG, James Marape, then replied to that and said that I want to take this moment and ask you, as in ask Modi, to offer a third big voice in the face of the global north. So saying that there are these two big voices in the region already, acknowledging that it's the US and China, and at the same time moderating it by asking India to be that third big voice. So clearly there is some understanding that there is no allied coexisting voice between India and China, despite both of them sharing whatever cultural, historical, regional similarities, and that the tensions have entrenched themselves in how the countries interact on the international stage. So, Saurabh, Amit, who I'd like to take this first. What do you think about Modi's comments? This is purely speculation, but do you think there is potential for India-China conflict to also come to the Pacific Islands?
I mean, see, the India-China conflict, I mean, it depends, right, in what context are we talking about. So there is this competition between India and China in trying to, be the leader of the global south, or at least be a voice which has weightage and which has value in the global south. So in that case, I think there is a strong enough case that both India and China can make, and I think that is what India is doing. I think the fact that it was during COVID that India did give out a lot of vaccines under its vaccine Maitri program with much opposition from the domestic audience, and also the fact that there were many, many countries, both developed and developing, especially the developed ones, who did not share their vaccines in the same way that India did. And that actually earned a lot of goodwill for India in the global south, especially as we're talking about in the Pacific Island nations. So I think in that way, I think this kind of, I would say, like competition is to be expected in like between India and China. And I think both Indian and Chinese leaders would try to present themselves as a better alternative. I mean, personally, I do think, I mean, India is a better alternative, but obviously India itself can't do things alone because of the resource constraints and differences between India and China in terms of resources. But India can very well partner with other countries, in the region. For example, India can easily partner with Australia and the US in the Pacific Island region, right? And same goes for countries in Africa or South America. So in this way, I think I would say that this kind of a competition is going on, and I don't see it, like reducing anytime soon, unless there is significant change in capability, either positive or negative, of both India or China. So this competition will remain. I think Indian Prime Minister was trying to highlight that there have been concerns regarding like China by both countries, who have like seen like China as a partner, but it did not come through when the help was needed. For example, COVID. And there's also, I think it also makes a point that countries have been in some kind of a debt trap because of Chinese investments, and the country is not being able to pay back loans. So I think this competition will stay. I don't think that's going to reduce. And I think we just have to make sure, India and its partners and allies are able to present a more front that is more united and has resources that it can commit, and also is able to execute projects properly. I think if we have that in order, I think India and its partners can give a tough fight to China.
Yeah, no, that makes absolute sense. And in fact, I think the context also in which Modi made his entire speech was cooperation on, climate change, food, fertilizers, pharmaceuticals, stuff like that. And of course, the backdrop to it all was indeed the pandemic.
Stay tuned to All Things Policy. We'll be right back after a short commercial break.
Amit, your thoughts on this?
Yeah. So before we get into discussing India-China competition in the Pacific, I think we need to remember that the Pacific Island Forum, the political grouping that these countries have formed, traditionally has been a region of influence of the ANZUS countries, that is Australia, New Zealand, and US. And the sphere of influence remains divided between these three countries. But the problem with this has been, or these traditional powers in the region has been, that they have been overly focused on security aspect. They have had some form of military association with respective countries in the Pacific Ocean, Southern Pacific Ocean. For example, US has three military association with three of the countries. Same with Australia also has it with two or three countries, and even New Zealand has such arrangement with one or two countries of the total 14, 15 countries that are there in the Pacific Ocean. But because they have been increasingly focused on security, they have tended to ignore the economic and developmental assistance that these countries require. These countries, in terms of GDP per capita and GDP per capita, these countries do not do quite good. And these are fairly poor countries that are in need of developmental assistance and economic aid. And this is where China has come in the Southern Pacific Ocean. And China, over the years, has become one of the largest providers of aid and assistance in these in the region. And this is what has got the three traditional powers in the region worried. And of late, these three countries have expanded their economic assistance and aid to these countries, but has been able to make some inroads in these Pacific Island countries, and therefore concerning three powers. And India so far has not been investor or an actor in this region. So to talk about India-China conflict in the Pacific Island, yes, there are ethnic relations and connections between India and some of the countries in the Pacific Island, but India is still quite not there when it comes to competing with China in the Pacific. But yes, India has a lot of goodwill, as Saurabh pointed out. During the COVID, it did not discriminate as the Western powers did, and did provide these Pacific Island countries with a lot of vaccines to cater for their population. So there's a lot of goodwill which India can capitalize and selectively provide aid to these countries, which would be meaningful. So yeah, those are my thoughts.
Right, right. Absolutely. And then there is another kind of internationalization of the tensions, which comes in the issue of counterterrorism. So we also saw earlier last month in May, that China exercised its veto power in the UN Security Council to put a technical hold on a proposal that India presented to designate Rauf Azhar, who is a senior leader in the Jaish-e-Mohammed, as a global terrorist. Now, the UNSC maintains a 1267 and ISIL and Al Qaeda sanctions list, and India wanted Rauf Azhar, like many other terrorists in the past, most of whom have origins in Pakistan, to be designated as global terrorists. But we've seen China kind of veto that. And in the SCO defense ministers meeting too, we saw that Defense Minister Rajnath Singh came down heavy-handedly on partnership towards counterterrorism. Of course, the SCO runs a regional anti-terrorist structure, which means all of the SCO countries, including Pakistan and China, participate in it with an aim to counter regional threats. But at the same time, China keeps putting technical holds on these Indian positions. Again, China also signed on to what was discussed vis-a-vis counterterrorism at the SCO defense ministers meeting, but then at the UNSC, the position is something else. So at the international stage, is this just another symptom of India-China tensions, or of India-Pakistan tensions reflecting in the triangle? Or does China actually not think some of these deserve to be designated as global terrorists? Then there is, of course, that debate that we come back to in the difference between rhetoric and reality, which almost always exists. But what are some of the reasons you folks think are behind this? Saurabh, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I would say again, I think this is just, I mean, I see it more as a fundamental issue, right? So even before in the India-China relationship, went downhill, especially for Doklam and then Galwan, China has been putting hold on India's efforts or well, I should say, China has been obstructing India's efforts to list these major terrorists at the UN sanctions committees. So they placed hold on Masood Azhar, and then I think there was one more, and then now this. So I think they've been doing this for a very long time. So I think this step is agnostic to the recent tensions. At the same time, I think this also kind of shows the kind of deep synergy that China and Pakistan have. I mean, if China agrees to sanction terrorists that are in Pakistan, are found in Pakistan, and then they are linked to outfits based in Pakistan, it does not look nice. So, and at the same time, I think China seems to be actively obstructing India's efforts to at least prevent spread of terrorism in its own in its own country and own areas. At the same time, I mean, obviously, it is in very contrast to the commitments made at the SCO. But I mean, interestingly, even the commitments made at the SCO are so flexible and broad that everybody can choose which is the terrorist they want to prevent and sanction, and which one they want to ignore if they're not the one uh, endangering you. So I just see that this is one more example of the power play between India and China exploiting its position at the UNSC to disadvantage India. And this is, I think, again, one of the other saying that there is a fundamental problem with in the India-China relationship, where China is not showing many signs that it wants to cooperate with India, at least in issues of mutual concerns such as threat of extremism and terrorism. And if even in a subject as benign and as universal as this, India and China can't find a common ground, especially with China being the obstruction, I see very limited hope in any significant reconciliation.
Yeah, I mean, you say China also has some backyard terrorism to counter, but what the CPC defines terrorism may sometimes just, at least to me, be peaceful expression of religious ideas. But let's not go into that. So I think I do agree. You make a lot of sense when you talk about this being especially the obstruction at the UNSC being more about saying more about China-Pakistan relations than about recent tensions in India-China relations. And of course, China did come around to allowing the designation of Makki as a global terrorist, I think in 2020 or 21. But that was 3 years after India and the US first put that proposal forward. So let's hope sometime soon we'll also see China budge on that. With that, I think I'll come to a close of the podcast. However, I would like to give my two colleagues an opportunity to give concluding thoughts, if any. Amit, I'd like to start with you.
Yeah, so before I conclude, just to add on to Saurabh's point, I think apart from the Pakistan factor, putting obstructions in designation of the UN terrorist, China also does it to derive sadistic pleasure out of by not letting India have its way on the UN platform. So insofar as my concluding remarks are concerned, I would say I find a bizarre contradiction, and I mean it's a bizarre, but again then understandable given China seem is a Marxist. Follows Marxist doctrine and seems to work in contradictions. So I see a glaring contradiction in what China preaches and what it does. So on one hand, our listeners must remember that Xi Jinping has made it a point to reiterate that development and security cannot be isolated, and that they have to be integrated, seen in an integrated manner, and that development has to be qualified by security. And anywhere where security is compromised, development cannot go ahead. But when it comes to India, our listeners would recall that every time there's a press release by the Chinese foreign ministry, what is pointed out by them is that India needs to keep the border situation away from in its proper place and away from the economics of the developmental relations that India and China can have. That is literally asking India to separate security from development. But when it comes to itself, China is in no mood to give away, to look at security and development in a completely isolated manner.
Yeah. Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. Saurabh, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I would say that I think these developments in the last few days, and I think the last few years, I think the India-China relationship is in deep trouble. And but I think we should also be mindful that if I mean no, not if I mean given that the Somdarongchu incident in 1980s, it took more than 5-6 years to get resolved, when the relative power differential between India and China was much less, and then the global context was also not as favorable. I think we should be prepared to be there for the long haul in the context of the Galwan crisis and the crisis in Ladakh. And I think it is this resolve that would kind of convey to China and to the global community that, India is ready to stand for its interest and will not be bullied. I mean, we also see, for example, recently there has been commentaries in Chinese media. I mean, especially the kind of a tabloid Global Times, which says, it is the West which is trying to create a wedge between India and China, and then, there is enough space for both India and China to grow in Asia. But I think Chinese actions in the last few years, especially in the last decade or so, show that China does not believe that there is enough space for both countries to rise peacefully and rise together. So I think we'll see how things evolve. I mean, the fact that the SCO summit, which is scheduled to happen in July, is now is going to happen virtually, means that there is one less chance for Xi Jinping and PM Modi to meet, because there was some speculation that SCO summit could be one opportunity for them to meet before the meeting again at the G20 summit. So let's see. I think we have to see how this evolves. There will be a chance for Xi Jinping to meet PM Modi when he comes for G20, if he comes. And so maybe that's one chance for some kind of a thaw, because it will be the first time both leaders will meet. Well, I mean, they have met before, but in not a bilateral setting. So there's that one potential for some thaw, but I am not hopeful. But let's see.
Right. Thanks, Amit. Thanks, Saurabh. On that somewhat optimistic note, I'll bring this podcast to a close. Thank you, Saurabh and Amit, for your brilliant insights. I'm sure our listeners will have something to take away from this, and they'll have food for thought. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in to yet another episode of All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.